Welcome to Unit 5 of Numi Dynamic Health. This is Judy Ann McNamara, the founder of Mish. And in this slideshow, we're going to look at some key elements of the Mish Numi Dynamic Method. It's the Numi Dynamic understanding of the creation of the disease, what we call pathogenesis, and how it's substantiated by current leading-edge research. We've been talking quite a bit about the pattern of me, and the importance of the forebrain in its ability to, to be able to create or get in touch with ideals, perfection, something absolute, an archetypal level or spiritual or implicate level. And this is an advanced functioning of the cerebral cortex and occurs especially in the forebrain. It's interesting that even the ancient Egyptians recognized the advanced powers of this part of the brain and its ability to access higher domains of contemplation. In Discover Holism, we looked at how the what-ifs, remember that? The what-ifs in the imagination and the ability to predict create stress by triggering the limbic brain and the HPA axis. In other words, the what-ifs in the imagination of the individual send signals to the limbic brain and the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, when the environment is misinterpreted because of the exaggerated susceptibility. Right? So we see here where the forebrain, the imagination of the future, the what-ifs, this could happen, those send signals as if those things were really happening. This is what we don't realize. Every time we say a what-if, as far as our limbic brain knows, it's a fact. So the hypothalamus, the thalamus, and the cerebellum get into action, the midbrain as well, and send signals to the pituitary and the adrenal, causing stress hormones to be released. So the pattern of me, as we can see, is a multi-dimensional concept. There's a natural dimension, and this corresponds to the 4 S's that were briefly discussed in Discover Holism, where we wanted to bring attention to the multidimensional aspect of the concept of self. We were starting to see how the striving to appropriate a divine virtue lends another dimension to the self-concept, right? We have the natural dimension, which is our sensory apparatus, how we take in the world, how we interpret the sensory information that comes in through our eyes and our ears and our sense of touch. And then there's the rational dimension that conceptualizes and can form concepts, both from the natural dimension, but also from an archetypal dimension, from that implicate order, from if you like, a spiritual level or symbolic level of reality. And so the rational dimension, which sits between the two and really should bridge the two, can actually use its ability to see or imagine perfection and predict, if you like, outcomes to aggravate, if you like, the natural dimension rather than bring them all together in a coherent whole. So these multi-dimensions, these 3 dimensions of consciousness, each adds another dimension to the pattern. So we have a sensory dimension, we have the rational dimension, which is all about conceptualization and the concept of self. And then that concept of self is compared to something perfect in the archetypal dimension. And that's very often where the stress is created, because it creates striving. The individual then wants to attain that quality for themselves, as part of their concept of self that has been created by the rational dimension. So this is where the archetypal dimension is being misused, if you like, by the human in making it into a striving and turning that into a self-concept, and then creating exaggerated susceptibility to different things in the environment, which then leads to exaggerated sensations and disease. I'm going to take a look at that process in a little more detail. I think we already did in Unit 1 actually quite a bit. And we looked in Unit 1 at the spiritual impulse and the soul as that essence, the absolute, the spiritual sun, the ideal of really what makes us unique. And how on that immaterial level, there's a sensitivity of the vital force to all of the impressions and signals in the environment, and there'll be a special susceptibility, a special desire to take up and be sustained by the spiritual impulse, by the things that symbolize, by that energy itself, actually in its pure form, that is our essence. So our dis-ease is when the ego striving happens, when there's an out of proportion, and that creates an out of proportion susceptibility to these symbols, to these things that symbol or represent that immaterial ideal. Okay, so what comes out of that are certain themes, immaterial themes of what the patient is susceptible. We talked about that, the focus, the interpretation, that are all representations of that spiritual impulse. They're not the real thing, but we take them for being the real thing. And that is the problem. That's what causes the stress. In that stressed and exaggerated susceptibility, that is when then we can fall prey or be tipped over, if you like, into disease by vaccines or medicine, pollutants, chemicals, bacteria, viruses, parasites, allergens in the air, any kind of trauma, even social psychological factors, things that can happen in our relationship. So those things are not causes, they are triggers. We need to be in an exaggerated state of susceptibility for those triggers to actually have an effect, and then to have a material manifestation in physical symptoms, pathologies, and functional disturbances, as well as infections. All right? So this is the multidimensional then understanding that we have of the creation of disease. So the pattern of me, the concept of self, knows its lack of substance. It is just a pattern. And one of the reasons why it feels so incomplete is because it's trying to compare itself to something perfect, to something whole. This actually is, I have the picture of the 3 goats here, which is from the Mish Mindful Monday series. If you haven't taken part in that series, if you didn't receive those emails, then you might want to go to the website. The link is in your resources section, in links to online resources, and it's on the website, on the Mish website, under free resources, Introduction to New Me Dynamic Awareness. So the pattern, the sense of me, the ego wants to perfect itself through certain conditions that it puts out for itself so that it can feel real. It wants to substantiate itself, realize itself. So the sense of incompleteness brings insecurity, feelings of lack, and that's what causes and creates stress. Whether though that sense of incompleteness is conscious or not, it is there. It's happening in the brain. It's every time we compare ourselves, every time we reflect, every time we see something that reminds us of our own ideal, there will be some kind of comparison going on. Okay, so let's stop here for a moment now that we've looked at this process and we looked at it in detail in Unit 1. And let's now go into a little bit of an understanding of stress and how we can deal with stress, because that's what this unit was about, was now actually putting this into practice. What's really important to recognize is that stressors in themselves have no negative effects, especially if they correspond to real physical dangers or a real need to adapt to a new situation, and that the individual can act on them right away, either fight, run away, physically defend or attack themselves, or that there can be some change in the organism that adapts to the new situation. So it's not the stressors that create disease. Well, the stressors are actually required, and the stress response is necessary for us to evolve and to adapt to our environment. It's that when there is no real danger, in other words, when it is just our idea or ideal that leads us to get stressed over time, get stressed over our image of what the boss will think, etc. What happens then is the body gets primed for physical action. Even though it's only in our mind, and even though it's only a what if, we're ready to flee or fight in an intense short burst, and that's what the body is primed for. The mitochondria in every single cell begin to transform energy reserves into energy that can be used for activity. So if there's nothing physical that the person can do, then this primed state remains, and there is an accumulation of stress signals that lead to chronic disease. This is the research done by Bruce McEwen, a leader in this field, who really was the leader in explaining how science explains that over 90% of all chronic disease is stress-related. He related the impact of stress, the impact of the wear and tear on the number of organs and tissues that can predispose the organism to disease because of the stress response. So in normal or healthy stress, what you see is that the stress level, the stress response rises quite rapidly to a peak, and then when the danger is over, slowly descends back to a normal low level. What we see, however, in chronic stress, is a little different story. So if there are repeated hits, in other words, in the first diagram, you can see that there is a repeated stress response. So the person is getting stressed regularly or over a period of time. What happens over that period of time is that there's less and less of an adaptive response. So instead of peaking up and then coming right down to the low levels, we see that the graph begins to change over time. This comes from research that was done and checking them into the mitochondria and and all of the signals in the blood. Over if there's a prolonged stress and chronic stress, in other words, the individual is always perceiving some kind of danger, then what we see is the high rise to a very high level and eventually the inability for that level to come down, so that the body stays in a stress response. And then over a longer period of time, the body loses its vital energy and its ability to respond and adapt. And what we find is that the vital energy and the ability to adapt and respond becomes very, very low. And this is the kind of thing that could very often lead to cancer and other chronic diseases. So we see that the body is primed for physical action. There's high levels of adenosine triphosphate that have to be converted to adenosine diphosphate through action, activity, in short bursts of high energy. So in producing those high levels of ATP, they have to be used for some kind of energy. And that's why high-intensity interval training is the most effective kind of exercise, because it reuses up those reserves of ATP and converts them to ADP, so that then the stress level can go down to normal. The mitochondria know that you have responded and we're still alive, so that's good news. So let's bring everything back to normal. If that energy is still there, then the mitochondria believe that you still need more energy. So in a way, high intensity interval exercise, if we look at these graphs that just came before, is a similar in that the high intensity exercise is like graph C, where it brings you to a high stress response, even higher than your usual level of stress, because it puts more stress on the organism. And it forces the organism then to respond because the excessive ATP has been used up, and then come back down to the normal level. Okay. And that's how a mouse exercises. A mouse, if left on its own and just left in its cage, will, especially at night, get up and run like crazy on its wheel at the fastest speed it can. Its little legs going at however fast it runs. And then it'll stop, go to a complete rest, and then begin again. Running at a very high intensity, and then stop. So this alternation between high intensity and complete rest in a very short interval is actually, what the mouse taught us, is the best way to exercise. Because if the body is primed, but there is no short burst of high intensity release, then the levels of reaction oxygen species, which are very dangerous for the body, rise. And they cause DNA damage, cell damage, lipid and protein damage. This is why high-intensity interval training shows better overall results than long, drawn-out cardio exercise. This has only been discovered in the last few years. We always thought that longer is better, and that even believed at one point that not stressing the system would be better. So of course it depends on every situation, and you'd have to consult your doctor or your trainer before embarking on a high intensity interval training program. You know, this is everybody is different, and you would definitely have to get personalized advice for that. But what we want to bring the emphasis to here is how the high intensity interval training is like a similar. Okay, it's a similar to that state. You already are in a stress response. What the high HIIT does is bring you into a higher stress response, using up that ATP, sending the signal to the mitochondria that yes, we have responded, and yes, we are still alive. So now you can go back to normal, and the mitochondria respond in like and bring down at least a bit from that residual high-level stress. Because if it's not, then what we see are the levels of DHEA, cortisol, inflammatory cytokines, and oxidative stress that remain. If these remain at a high level, these signals remain at the high level, then we create stress, excessive stress, and signal our allostatic stress response network. Mitochondria respond to all these important signals. They are affected by everything happening in the body, and not just the body, the mind too. Over time, this hormonal soup will cause chronic disease such as diabetes, obesity, immune function, it will affect cardiovascular function, our skin, our veins, and our circulatory system, as well as our nervous system. So, in summary, the body is designed to respond to stress in this way: to gear up for intense action, to act, and then rest. So high intensity for 15 minutes has been shown to reduce the stress markers for up to 48 hours. Okay, that's what makes it a similars form of the treatment of stress. What you have to remember here, however, is that yes, it helps reduce the residual stress, but if you're creating more stress, every day, then that means that you're not really getting to the cause, right? You are simply getting rid of some of the effects. So it's definitely a necessary step, but it is not curative. It is palliative. Okay, so that's what we have to understand. So exercise is necessary in a stress-filled society and the way we live, but it will not cure the high levels of stress. It will just keep them, keep bringing them back to a level that is much less dangerous for the body. We create stress in so many different ways, not only at work, but with videos, adventure movies, video games, and our emotional reactions. We can create drama in our lives. We can actually even become addicted to the stress response hormones and the effect on our adrenals and other organs. In other words, there's a surge or excitement that our body can actually become addicted to, and that without our knowing, we actually seek out. We can seek out drama in our lives. And if you don't have that experience, perhaps you can think about people around you or that you know who have a lot of drama in their lives and always seem to be in an emotional reaction of some kind. There's a good book by Candace Pert called The Molecules of Emotion. It's a bit dated now, but it had a lot of leading edge research that showed how we can get addicted to our own internal pharmacy. Of course, we know that things like sugar and alcohol and other things will are adrenaline releasers, and that we again become addicted to. Sugar was called the cocaine of in 17th century. People had a sugar high, and we don't get that anymore because we already are at that level. We are already at a much higher stress level. So it has less of an impact, but we have to have, and then once we get addicted to it, we need more and more of it to have the impact that we want on our system, that we're addicted to having on our system. The other thing that has that effect, of course, is our sense of self, its relationship to, finances, how we worry about finances, worry about judgment, the fear of judgment, fear of, our perception of being rejected or our fear of being rejected. All of these things, you can do nothing physically to address them. They can't be relieved, and they are very dangerous stressors. So a lot of people think of meditation when they think of stress release. And yes, meditation does reduce the stress level by relieving the production of stress response hormones, which means that we have a less intense stress response, especially to ideas coming from our minds. So we can see here where both meditation and exercise can help relieve the consequences, especially the short-term consequences of chronic stress. But they don't cure chronic stress. They would have to be done continually, every day, as part of your daily routine, which isn't a bad idea. Just to keep the damage at bay, though. They're not really curative. So now let's look at how, using the Misch method, we actually look at curing people from creating chronic stress in their lives, be it through their addictions, be it through their emotional reactions, or their perceptions or striving. One of our measurements for stress levels is called forces. You're going to hear a lot about forces in your training at Misch. These are our guidelines that we use with our patients in order to measure their vitality generally and their ability to sustain themselves with their environment, and their ability to adapt and their ability to respond to whatever needs they have for whatever vital needs they have. So the F stands for freedom, the O for optimism, R for relationships, C for, in this sense, chief complaint, E for the emergence of self, the or increased energy, and S for susceptibility and sensation. Of course, we want the sensation to be decreased, and we want susceptibility to be brought back to normal susceptibility and not an exaggerated one. So let's look at this a little bit more detail, because it's interesting to understand, and it might be something that, and I think it's part of your holistic integration exercise as well. So the freedom of response. We know that things are going wrong in our body when we're reduced to freeze and flight. In other words, when we're always reacting rather than responding. And especially if we're reacting in a way that is out of proportion to the situation. Feeling that our options are limited, or when we feel stuck in judgment, or when we feel stuck in some way of reacting, we feel stuck in our anger, or stuck in our sadness, stuck in our disappointment, stuck in our sense of self. Though that's an important sign to know that our vitality is at risk. The other sign is the O, the lack of objectivity and hope, optimism. We lose our objectivity. As we said, when there's an over-focus on an attribute or on a certain theme in our lives, then we know that we have lost our objectivity, that we are over-focused, we're no longer objective, and we're starting to misperceive and misinterpret things. We can also tell by our relationships. Reactions and projections create tensions in our relationships. And we know through our chronic conditions, and our complaints, our symptoms, the pains and aches, the indigestion, the increased sensitivity to pollen, the itchiness, the reaction, our skin, our psoriasis, our eczema, whatever. Those are our little warning lights. And then there's the E for energy. As we talked about, the levels of ROS, reduction oxidation series, leads to lower levels of vitality. It attacks everything, all of our organs, all of our tissues in our body, and leads to lack of energy, excessive fatigue, mental distraction, preoccupation, memory loss. Why? Because we're focused on threat. We're focused on what might threaten my idea of self. And then finally, the susceptibility, our reaction to effectors, and our sensations. These are due to functional changes and changes in the nervous system. When we start feeling sensations in our body and feeling sensations that we normally should not feel, then we know that there's an increased susceptibility. So these are the six important markers that we use to evaluate how a patient is doing after treatment. So the question now can come up: can we trust a patient's self-rated health as a reliable indication of health? And I'd like to address this because it's really important. The whole MISH method is based on the subjective evaluation of the patient, of themselves. So what's the proof that that works? Let's take a quick look at that. This is a research paper written by Dr. Martin Picard, who is a MISH graduate and a researcher. He's now doing mitochondrial research and publishing quite a number of papers in important journals. And one of his papers that he wrote while he was studying at MISH is the whole greater than the sum of parts? So he wrote this paper on self-rated health and transdisciplinarity. In other words, the relationship between the two as well, that we can't do self-rated health and think only of one aspect of health, in other words, only the physical aspect. Self-rated health is in combination with an attitude, or if you like, an approach that takes in many different kinds of disciplines, that would take in then psychology, sociology, physiology. So we have to look at body-mind when we're doing this. When he read other people who had done research in this area, he found some interesting conclusions, such as this one, where patients experience physical symptoms and dysfunctions in a more global manner than what we initially thought, or certainly what medical conceptions would suggest. In other words, there is a total sense of well-being. Yes, we can have an ache or pain here or there, but what is our total sense of well-being? What is our global sense of ourselves? And that is what the self-rated health is mostly geared to, is what do you feel like generally on the different levels? The amount of research that had been done even at that time, where you see that it goes back to 1997 and even earlier, that self-rated health was the conclusion in all of these articles, actually, and many more, I think a total of 40 or 50, and then we lost count, that we had found that self-rated health is the most powerful statistical predictor of both morbidity and mortality. In other words, the most powerful statistical predictor of death and disease. Oh, so yes, actually it was 93 studies. I'd lost count. So researchers in over 93 studies have reported, and this was in 2007, I believe, or 2007 or 2009, that we reported how an individual rates his or her health is a strong predictor of cancer, cardiovascular disease, as well as mortality. And that's just to name a few. Morbidity and mortality in both healthy and chronically ill individuals can be more accurately predicted by self-rated health than any other combination of objective and subjective measures. Okay, so what they're saying here is that even clinical tests, blood tests, any other kind of testing you do is less accurate in predicting how long you will live and whether or not you will get sick than self-rated health. So one of the other conclusions, of course, is that in spite of mounting evidence, medical practice is still strongly inclined towards the exclusive use of clinical measures, in other words, blood, scans, blood work, etc., and ignore the empirical value of self-reported global health assessments. And everybody has had that experience. And why is that? That is because current medical practice is limited to allopathy, and all allopathy can do is reduce symptoms, go against the body in order to stop its signaling process and reduce the experience of symptoms. It cannot sustain, it cannot revitalize, it cannot uphold the vital force that then could lead to an actual cure. Therefore, since they don't have anything to give to the vital force, why would they be interested in asking about it? So of course they're not taught that method, nor are they taught the importance of it. Although things are changing because of this overwhelming research showing how important the patient's subjective experience is. Okay, and this is the predictability has been associated with everything from depressive symptoms, to the level of cytokines. In other words, self-rated health can accurately be correlated to the cytokines and some of the stress responses in your body, to how much physical activity you do or not, how much social support you have. So we can look at both internal and external factors and correlate them with, in a way, what the patient already knows about themselves. Okay. But the self-rated health itself can independently predict mortality. And it's interesting to look at these research papers and see the actual graphs of sometimes studies that involved thousands of people over a long term, sometimes 20, 30 years of what their self-rated health is and how that corresponds to how long they lived. In other words, how healthy they really were. So our self-perception of how healthy we are is the most reliable indicator of our vital force and our true state of health. So what are these patients in touch with? Okay, we know that the patient knows that something is going on, even when the tests don't show anything. But when the tests don't show anything, the doctor says it's in your head, or I can't find anything wrong, and either sends you home or gives you an antidepressant. Okay, this is another illustration that the analysis of the parts cannot describe what is happening within the whole individual. And that's why Martin called this paper is the whole greater than the sum of the parts, and it is. Asking the individual about themselves globally tells us much more than any part can tell us. And basically, any kind of test that the medical establishment does, the current medical establishment does, is a partial test, is just of a part, an analysis of a part. And we expect that analysis of the part to tell us what's going on in the organism as a whole, and we can't. That is impossible. The part can sometimes reflect what's going on in the whole, but cannot tell us what's going on in the whole. Okay, and of course, such physical tests can't be relied upon for preventative care. They're not really telling us what's happening and how it can be addressed globally. And again, because there is nothing in current medical practices in allopathy to be able to encourage the vital force and encourage the organism as a whole, then of course there's no sense in them. I imagine they see in pursuing that. Okay, so here we're asking how the patient, if it's come to the conclusion that yes, the patient can accurately assess how healthy they are. Is asking the individual to get in touch with him or herself a reliable way to diagnose? Is another question. In creating our method at Miche, we collaborated with the McGill University Health Center. This center provides multidisciplinary treatment for patients with pain using state-of-the-art methods. And Martin did his thesis at Miche based on a collaboration with patients at the McGill University Health Center. So their research was to individualize by getting the patient to describe the sensation of pain most accurately, to describe their unique personal experience of pain. And what they found is that the more the description of pain is individualized, the more effective the pain management would be. So by getting the person to describe and enter into their personal, unique experience of pain, the method, whatever methods that they used for pain management were much more effective. So this is one way, if you like, of diagnosing, right? The patient then created their own prescription by being able to enter into the kind of pain that they experienced, okay, and to personalize it. So this is a sample questionnaire, or a little excerpt from the sample questionnaire that they used in this study. And what we see here are very similar questions to what we've done in homeopathy for over 200 years. All of these are rubrics in our repertory. It's all things that we have discovered in our provings and in our clinical treatment of patients over the last 200 years. So what I'd like to do now is just spend the next few minutes looking at the Miche Mnemodynamic method. Okay, the Miche Mnemodynamic method, when applied to homeopathy, that is, okay, in the Miche Mnemodynamic method, we don't have to go into this amount of exploration, but we can. But if we were to enter into a homeopathic treatment, then we definitely have to use this process that will go from objective observations and a local description of the pathology, such as arthritis of the hip, to and lead to a subjective and global experience of the patient. Okay, so the patient comes in, I have arthritis in my hip. That is what the doctor told that person. You recognize that, of course, that this is a name that they were given. Arthritis is a name given to a group of symptoms. So there's pathologies are simply categories of symptoms that then we group together and we say, well, that group of symptoms corresponds to arthritis, or that group of symptoms corresponds to rheumatism, or that group of symptoms. Okay, so the pathology is simply a name. But what is the name of? We can see that's just the tip of the iceberg. Okay, this is an objective outside. It's not even an evaluation, actually. It simply is a name given to the dis-ease, to whatever this patient is experiencing. It does not say anything about the individual, nothing at all. So the pathology for us as homeopaths does not tell us anything about the individual, and does very little to help us explore and come to a good simillimum that will support the entire organism globally as a whole. Pathology is usually local. It's about a part or parts, as we said, and not the whole. What we need at the very least is a subjective description by the patient of what they are experiencing and what led them to go to the doctor or get those tests done to begin with. So we need to know how the patient experiences it. Is it worse at night? Does it keep you awake? What kind of pain is it? Is it restricted? Does it restrict movement of your leg? How does it feel? Is it stuck? Is it blocked? So this tells us a bit about the individual because it's the patient's experience and not just an external diagnosis. We find out why they went to get help. Then we're going to find out the emotional reaction. I feel stuck is a global feeling. It's on the level of emotion. It's on the level of feeling, actually. I am irritable, cross, and dissatisfied. You see, the irritability, can we just say we feel irritable in our hand or in our head? No, we feel irritable. It's a whole organism. You see, we're getting more to a global response here, or reaction. So when the person has their arthritis, when that pain comes on, their emotional reaction to that is anger, irritability, crossness. Now we want the subjective interpretation of that experience. Okay, so how does that affect you? Well, my arthritis restricts me from doing what I want. My arthritis blocks me. I have no way out. My life is interrupted by my arthritis. Now, I hope you can see that none of these things are literal. Arthritis cannot block you, cannot restrict your exits or your options. Okay, it's that is how I interpret what the arthritis does to me. It stops me from doing what I want. It blocks me. So we're becoming more and more individualized here. We're finding more and more about the unique experience of that patient. Another patient might say something totally different, that their emotional reaction might be sadness or disappointment, and the feeling and their subjective interpretation might be that there's nobody to help them, or that there's nobody to rely on. You see? So we can have the same pathology, but a completely different emotional reaction and a completely different subjective interpretation. And then if we go deeper, we'll see that we have totally different images and metaphors as we talk to different patients. So in this example, the patient could say something like, "It's as if the flow of my life has stopped and I must break through a barrier." Now we have an image. We have a picture that in a way has no direct response, no direct cause and effect link to arthritis. What it is, though, is it does correspond for this person, that disease with the pain that it has corresponds to a picture in their minds of stopping the flow of life and the need for them to break through a barrier. Of course, this is all a metaphor, because what barrier would it be? What flow is being stopped? Okay. All right, so now we've crossed into an inner unconscious world, right? We've come into the inner world of the patient that is really specific to the patient, and that there is no way that we could know that image without getting it from the patient. It's totally invisible to the outside. And then as they're describing that inner image, they will get to a place where words aren't enough, and they'll be using gestures to describe a sensation, to describe the sensations of being blocked, of barriers, of flow, and what that feels like, what that experience, what that global experience is for the patient. What are they pointing to with that metaphor or that image? And then finally, with further exploration, we will be able to start discerning what the striving might be, what the spiritual value might be, what all of this is really about. And that's a whole other level of case taking, and it's a fascinating one. And that's where we find then that all of it comes together. It's all a whole. So the addressing the individual as a whole requires a holistic perception, a view of the individual which is primary to the physical, emotional, or physical considerations, but also embraces all three. So it's at the root of all three, but is bigger than all three. It addresses something greater than the mere sum or intersection of the parts. The vital field is what organizes and orchestrates all of life processes. This deep energetic level or field level is not a physical, it goes beyond the physical level. It's the precursor to the physical level. Addressing the whole as a whole by going beyond all three to a level which is at the root of all three is really what the process is about. Okay, so let's just take a quick look at the Misch model. And we see how we bring the patient through a process where we begin with the pathology, but then go into signs, functions, feelings, behavior, sensations, and finally the dynamis, the energy, the absolute, the symbolic level as well. Now, what's really interesting is with homeopathy, our provings provide us with information on all of these levels. So when provings are conducted with homeopaths, very often medical doctors, with healthy individuals, they experience a disturbed susceptibility, a different sense of self, a striving. They experience different sensations, will get different images, will have different dreams, will notice that they have a different flavor of thoughts and be interpreting their world in a different way, as well as having emotions that they don't usually have. In other words, they experience a general state as well as a local problem. They might even have sensations or feelings or pain in different areas of their body. So all of these symptoms, all of these indicators are accessible through the materia medica. So we have a subjective process that then correlates to objective results coming out of the provings and clinical documentation. We know which remedies are optimal for certain pathologies, if in emergency situations, through clinical documentation, through our clinical experience. But the essence of the remedy is revealed through the provings of the remedies and through a soul-level analysis of the provings based on Aristotle's understanding of the soul. So how do we know when stress has been released and if healing is happening after we've given a remedy? We see that the person has a greater freedom to explore and appreciate their world and their environment. They are open to more possibilities. They are more optimistic. They see possibilities where they thought there were none. Their optimism leads them to trust that things will work out. We see a shift in their relationships that are built on trust, trusting the innate wisdom in our friends, our family, and children to guide them. And we encourage their innate wisdom, not obedience to our point of view or taking our advice or feeling that we know or what they should do or worry about what they should do. That doesn't mean we're not concerned and that we're not good listeners, but our relationships are built on trust and openness. We see a richness in our relationships. We see less projection, less control, less blame and judgment, all of those things. And we see greater calmness, a reduction of our chronic pains, a reduction of our complaints, and calmness in the face of pain or physical dysfunction. Well, we know that emotional reaction increases our suffering and our experience of pain. Morphine only calms the emotional reaction. It doesn't actually do anything for the pain centers. But by reducing our emotional reaction, it reduces our experience of pain and our complaints. So calmness and energy, E for the energetic, vital attitude towards life, full access to whatever our vital energy can provide. An appropriate sensitivity to and appreciation of one's environment. That's the other E, is that we become more aware and sensitive in a positive way to our environment, noticing more things like when there's bird songs or the blueness of the sky or the beauty of a flower. And then the S is our increased spontaneity, our reduced susceptibility, and reduced sensations. So it's all 6 parameters that are indications of whether or not we are on the right track and whether or not a healing process is taking place. So it's not necessarily that the pathological signs disappear right away. There might be a process that needs to happen, a physical process for the body to reverse whatever has been happening and come back to a new homeostasis or create a new allostasis in the body, allodynamic response in the body. But if we see that all 6 parameters are going in the right direction, we know that that's going to happen. That whatever the vital force is capable of, it's going to do. So I hope you enjoyed this. If you have any questions, please post them in the classroom. We love to answer your questions through the classroom. And there will be 2 live webinars. And the live webinars are to facilitate your own personal process. We will concentrate on the holistic integration rather than the conceptualization. We want these courses to be your opportunity to experience the teachings, to experience and bring the concepts into your own life. So I hope you enjoyed this course, and I hope you will continue with us in Energy Anatomy to learn an in-depth exploration of our soul's code and our body's messages.